The dust never settled in Copper Ridge Valley, not even when the wind died down to nothing. It hung in the air like broken promises, coating everything with the taste of defeat. This was Arizona territory in 1887, where hope withered faster than crops in a drought, and desperation drove good men to make choices that would haunt them forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Samuel Whitmore stood on the cracked porch of his homestead, watching the sun bleed orange across a sky that hadn't seen rain in 4 months. His weathered hands gripped the wooden railing until his knuckles went white, and his eyes held the hollow look of a man who'd counted his last dollar twice and still came up short. The Whitmore ranch stretched out before him, 1,500 acres of what used to be prime grazing land, now nothing but stubble and dust devils dancing where cattle once roamed. Behind him, through the thin walls of the house his grandfather built, he could hear his daughter Clara moving about in the kitchen, probably preparing another meal of beans and hardtack. She never complained, not once in all these months of watching their world crumble piece by piece. That made what he was about to do cut even deeper into his soul. The letter in his shirt pocket felt heavier than a millstone. Victor Blackwood's elegant handwriting spelled out terms that no father should ever have to consider. But Samuel had run out of choices the day the bank threatened foreclosure. Blackwood owned half of Copper Ridge Valley already, and he wanted the water rights that came with the Whitmore land. More than that, he wanted Clara. Samuel had seen the way Blackwood looked at his daughter during their few encounters in town. Not with love or even genuine desire, but with the cold calculation of a man acquiring property. Clara was 22. Beautiful in that quiet way that didn't demand attention, but earned it anyway. And she'd turned down every suitor who'd come calling. She valued her independence too much, spent too much time reading books and helping run the ranch to settle for just any man. But Blackwood wasn't just any man. He was the wealthiest landowner in 3 counties, with fingers in everything from cattle to silver mining. When he decided he wanted something, he usually got it. And now he wanted Clara, along with the land that would complete his stranglehold on the valley's water supply. The sound of hoofbeats on the dusty road made Samuel look up. A lone rider approached, sitting tall in the saddle despite the punishing heat. As the figure drew closer, Samuel could make out a man in his 30s, dressed in dark clothing that had seen better days, but was kept clean and mended. His hat was pulled low, casting shadows across features that seemed carved from the same hard stone as the surrounding mesas. The stranger reined in his horse at the gate, touching the brim of his hat in greeting. "Afternoon," he called out, his voice carrying a slight rasp that spoke of too many nights sleeping under the stars. "Name's Ethan Cross. I heard in town you might have work for a man who knows his way around cattle." Samuel studied the newcomer carefully. There was something about Ethan Cross that didn't quite fit with the typical drifters who passed through Redstone Creek looking for work. His horse was a fine piece of horseflesh, well cared for, and obviously expensive. His gun belt was worn, but the leather was quality, and the Colt at his hip had the look of a weapon that had been used and maintained by someone who knew what he was doing. "Most of my cattle are dead or sold off," Samuel replied, walking down from the porch. "Can't pay much for the work that's left." Ethan dismounted with the easy grace of a man who'd spent most of his life in the saddle. "I'm not looking for much pay. Just a place to rest my horse and maybe a hot meal now and then. I've got my own reasons for wanting to stay in this area for a while." There was something in the way he said it that made Samuel curious but desperate. Men couldn't afford to be too particular about the help they accepted. "What kind of experience you got?" "Worked ranches from Texas to Montana. No cattle, horses, and how to fix just about anything that breaks." Ethan's eyes swept over the property, taking in the sagging fence posts and the barn that needed new shingles. "Looks like you got plenty of both around here." Samuel was about to respond when the front door opened, and Clara stepped out onto the porch. She'd changed from her work clothes into a simple blue dress, and her dark hair was pinned up in a way that showed off the graceful line of her neck. When she saw the stranger, she paused, one hand resting lightly on the porch rail. "Papa, is everything all right?" Her voice carried that musical quality that had always reminded Samuel of her mother, gone these past 10 years. "Just a man looking for work, sweetheart." "Ethan Cross, this is my daughter Clara." Ethan removed his hat entirely, revealing sandy brown hair and eyes the color of storm clouds. He nodded respectfully, but Samuel noticed the way his gaze lingered on Clara's face, and more importantly, the way her cheeks flushed, slightly under his attention. "Mr. Cross," Clara replied, her voice steady despite the color in her face. "Will you be staying for supper? It's nothing fancy, but there's enough." "That's kind of you, but I wouldn't want to impose." "No imposition," Samuel found himself saying. "Consider it part of your wages. You can bed down in the bunkhouse tonight, and we'll see how things work out." As Clara disappeared back into the house, Samuel caught Ethan watching her go with an expression that was hard to read. There was appreciation there, certainly, but something else as well. Something that looked almost like recognition, though Samuel was certain they'd never met before. The three of them shared a simple meal as the sun set, painting the valley in shades of gold and purple. Clara had managed to find some preserved peaches to go with the beans and cornbread, and the conversation flowed easier than Samuel had expected. Ethan was well-spoken and had traveled enough to have interesting stories, but he was careful not to share too much about his past or his reasons for being in Copper Ridge Valley. "You mentioned silver mining in Colorado," Clara said, leaning forward slightly. "Did you work the mines yourself?" "For a while," Ethan replied, his expression growing distant. "Dangerous work, and the pay wasn't worth the risk. I prefer working under open sky. Most men do, until they get desperate." "Enough," Samuel observed, thinking of his own situation. Ethan's eyes sharpened slightly. "Desperation makes men do things they never thought they would. Sometimes that leads to opportunity, sometimes to regret." There was weight behind those words that made Samuel wonder what kind of desperation had driven Ethan Cross to their door. But before he could pursue the thought, Clara stood to clear the dishes. "I'll help with those," Ethan offered, starting to rise. "That's not necessary," Clara said quickly. "You've had a long day of travel." "So have you, from what I can see. A ranch doesn't run itself, especially when you're short-handed." The simple observation, delivered without condescension or surprise, seemed to catch Clara off guard. Most men who came through didn't expect a woman to be involved in the actual running of a ranch, much less acknowledge her efforts. "Thank you," she said quietly, and this time when she smiled, it reached her eyes. Later, after Ethan had settled into the bunkhouse and Clara had gone to bed, Samuel sat alone on the porch with Blackwood's letter burning a hole in his pocket. Tomorrow was the deadline. Tomorrow he would have to give Blackwood an answer, or lose everything his family had built over 3 generations. The sound of footsteps on gravel made him look up. A then approached from the direction of the bunkhouse, moving quietly in the moonlight. "Couldn't sleep," Ethan explained. "Thought I'd check on the horses." Samuel nodded toward the empty chair beside him. "Mind if I ask you something, Cross?" Ethan settled into the chair, his posture relaxed but alert. "Shoot." "You don't strike me as the kind of man who drifts from ranch to ranch looking for work. You've got education, good gear, and that horse of yours cost more than most men make in a year. What are you really doing here?" For a long moment, Ethan was silent, his eyes fixed on the star-scattered sky. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. "Let's just say I have an interest in seeing that Victor Blackwood doesn't get everything he wants in this valley." Samuel's blood went cold. "You know about Blackwood?" I know he's been buying up land and squeezing out families who've been here for generations. I know he's got the local bank in his pocket and uses it to pressure people into selling for less than their property's worth. Ethan turned to look at Samuel directly. And I know he's made you an offer you're supposed to accept tomorrow. How could you possibly know that? Ethan was quiet for another moment, seeming to weigh his words carefully. Because Victor Blackwood killed my brother. The stark statement hung in the night air like a physical presence. Samuel felt his mouth go dry. 2 years ago, my brother Marcus owned a small spread up in Montana. Blackwood wanted his land for a railroad, but Marcus wouldn't sell. One night, Marcus was found shot dead on his own property. The local sheriff ruled it an accident, said Marcus must have surprised some rustlers. But there were no missing cattle, and the only thing taken was the deed to his land, which mysteriously showed up in Blackwood's possession a week later. You have proof? Nothing that would stand up in court. Blackwood's too smart for that. But I've spent the last 2 years following his trail, watching him destroy families and communities from Montana to here. I know his methods, and I know he won't stop until he owns everything worth having in Copper Ridge Valley. Samuel's hands were shaking now. He wants to marry Clara, says if I agree to the marriage and sign over the land, he'll pay off my debts and let me stay on as foreman. And if you refuse? Foreclosure. I lose everything anyway, and Clara. Samuel's voice trailed off. Clara what? He made it clear that his offer was the only thing standing between her and a much worse fate. Said a beautiful woman alone in this territory might find herself in situations that no father would want for his daughter. Ethan's jaw tightened. He threatened her. Not in so many words, but the meaning was clear enough. They sat in silence for a while, both men lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Ethan spoke again. What if there was another way? What do you mean? What if someone else made Blackwood a better offer? Someone who could outbid him and take you and Clara out of his reach permanently. Samuel laughed bitterly. There's no one in this territory with that kind of money who'd be willing to cross Blackwood. He's got too much power, too many connections. Maybe not in this territory, Ethan said quietly. Before Samuel could ask what he meant, the sound of breaking glass came from inside the house, followed by Clara's sharp cry of alarm. Both men were on their feet instantly, Samuel reaching for the rifle he kept by the door while Ethan's hand moved to his gun. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The front door burst open and Clara stumbled out, her white nightgown torn at the shoulder and her hair disheveled. Behind her came 3 men Samuel recognized as some of Blackwood's hired hands, rough characters who spent more time intimidating people than working cattle. Sorry to disturb your evening, Whitmore, called the largest of the 3, a mean-faced man named Jake Morrison. Mr. Blackwood sent us to deliver a message. Get off my land, Samuel snarled, raising his rifle. Morrison laughed. Now that's not very friendly. We just came to remind you that Mr. Blackwood's offer expires at midnight tomorrow. He wanted to make sure you understood the consequences of refusing. One of the other men, a wiry character, with dead eyes, grabbed Clara's arm and pulled her closer. He also wanted us to give Miss Clara here a preview of what life might be like if she doesn't have his protection. That was as far as he got before Ethan moved. Samuel had been in his share of fights over the years, but he'd never seen anyone move like Ethan Cross did in that moment. 1 second he was standing beside the porch rail, the next he was behind the man holding Clara, his gun pressed against the back of the man's skull. Let her go, Ethan said quietly, his voice carrying a tone that raised the hair on Samuel's arms. Who the hell are you? Morrison demanded, his own gun half drawn. Someone who doesn't like seeing ladies mistreated, Ethan replied. Now tell your friend to let go of Miss Whitmore, and the 3 of you can ride back to your boss with all your parts still attached. The tension stretched like a wire about to snap. Morrison's eyes flicked between Ethan's gun and Samuel's rifle, calculating. Odds. Finally, he jerked his head at his companion. Let her go, Bobby. We delivered the message. Bobby released Clara's arm reluctantly, his eyes never leaving Ethan's face. This ain't over, stranger. No, Ethan agreed. It's not. The three men backed toward their horses, Morrison calling over his shoulder, Remember, Whitmore. Midnight. Tomorrow, Mr. Blackwood don't like to be kept waiting. As the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance, Clara sank down onto the porch steps, her whole body shaking. Samuel knelt beside her, his hands gentle as he checked her torn shoulder. Did they hurt you, sweetheart? No, Papa. They came through my window and said they wanted to show me what I could expect if I didn't cooperate with Mr. Blackwood's plans. Ethan holstered his gun and crouched down in front of Clara, his eyes serious. Miss Whitmore, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Victor Blackwood is a dangerous man who won't stop at threats. If we're going to keep you safe, we need to be smart about how we handle this. Clara looked up at him, her eyes still wide with fear but showing a spark of determination. What do you suggest, Mr. Cross? First, we need to get you somewhere. Safe until tomorrow night. Then, we're going to give Blackwood something he doesn't expect, which is... Ethan glanced at Samuel, then back at Clara. Competition. The morning sun painted Copper Ridge Valley in shades of gold and amber, but the beauty of the landscape couldn't hide the tension that crackled through the air like lightning before a storm. Clara Whitmore stood at her bedroom window, watching Ethan Cross work with one of the horses in the corral below. He moved with a confidence and skill that spoke of years in the saddle, but there was something else about him, something that made her pulse quicken in a way she'd never experienced before. She'd barely slept after the events of the previous night. Every time she closed her eyes, she could feel those rough hands grabbing her, hear the ugly laughter of Blackwood's men as they made their threats. But more than the fear, she remembered the way Ethan had appeared like an avenging angel, the deadly calm in his voice as he'd pressed his gun to Bobby's skull. There had been something almost familiar about the way he'd moved, as if he'd been in similar situations before. Clara had grown up around ranch hands and drifters, but Ethan Cross was different. He carried himself like a man accustomed to command, someone who'd had authority and lost it, or perhaps someone who'd walked away from it by choice. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Clara, honey, breakfast is ready, her father called. She turned away from the window, smoothing her brown riding skirt and checking her reflection in the small mirror above her dresser. Face that looked back at her was pale but determined. Whatever Ethan Cross had planned, she was ready to hear it. Samuel was already seated at the kitchen table when she came down, his face grim as he stared into his coffee cup. The cheerful morning light streaming through the windows seemed almost mocking given the circumstances they faced. "Where's Mr. Cross?" Clara asked, taking her seat and reaching for the pot of porridge she'd prepared earlier. "Checking the perimeter. Making sure none of Blackwood's men are watching the house," Samuel replied. "He thinks they might try something before tonight. What exactly did he mean about giving Blackwood competition? Who could possibly outbid a man like that?" Samuel's expression grew thoughtful. "I've been wondering the same thing. Cross isn't telling us everything about himself. That much is clear. The way he handled those men last night, the quality of his gear, the fact that he knows so much about Blackwood's operations. There's more to Ethan Cross than meets the eye." Before Clara could respond, the back door opened and Ethan stepped. Inside, his hat in his hand and his expression serious. He'd changed from his work clothes into a clean white shirt and dark pants, and Clara couldn't help but notice how the morning light caught the gray flecks in his storm cloud eyes. "Miss Whitmore, Mr. Whitmore," he nodded to each of them in turn. "I've been thinking about our situation, and I have a proposal." "We're listening," Samuel said. Ethan pulled out a chair and sat down, his movements deliberate and controlled. Blackwood expects you to either accept his terms or lose everything to foreclosure. What he doesn't expect is a third option, which is, Clara prompted, a public auction. Today, in Redstone Creek, with the entire valley invited to witness, Samuel frowned. An auction of what? I've got nothing left to sell except the land, and I can't sell that without losing Clara to Blackwood anyway. Not an auction of property, Ethan said quietly. An auction for Clara's hand in marriage. The silence that followed was deafening. Clara felt the blood drain from her face, while Samuel's expression darkened like a thundercloud. Absolutely not, Samuel said firmly. I won't have my daughter put up for sale like a piece of livestock. It's not what you think, Ethan said. Quickly, holding up a hand. Hear me out. Blackwood's whole plan depends on him being the only option. But if we make it a public auction, with witnesses from across the valley, we change the game entirely. How? Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Because I'm going to bid against him, and I'm going to win. Samuel leaned back in his chair, studying Ethan with new interest. With what money? You're a drifter looking for work, remember? Ethan reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch. He opened it and poured its contents onto the table. Gold. Coins spilled out, more than Clara had ever seen in one place. But it was the silver badge that caught her attention, the 5-pointed star that read U.S. Marshal in bold letters across the top. My name is Ethan Cross, he said quietly. I was a U.S. Marshal for 8 years before my brother was killed. I've been tracking Victor Blackwood ever since, gathering evidence of his crimes across 3 territories. The gold is reward money from bounties I've collected over the past 2 years. Clara stared at him in shock. You're a lawman? Was a lawman. I resigned my commission after Marcus died, when I realized the law couldn't touch men like Blackwood. Sometimes you have to fight corruption with other methods. Samuel picked up one of the gold coins, testing its weight. This is enough to pay off my debts and then some. But why would you do this? What's in it for you? Blackwood will never stop, Ethan replied. He'll keep destroying families and communities until someone stops him permanently. This is my chance to do that, to save your family and gather the evidence I need to see him brought to justice. And Clara? Samuel asked. What happens to her in this plan of yours? Ethan turned to look at Clara directly, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. That would be entirely up to Miss Whitmore. The marriage would be legal, but it would also be her choice whether to honor it or have it annulled once Blackwood is dealt with. Clara felt her heart hammering against her ribs. The practical part of her mind recognized that Ethan's plan offered them a way out of an impossible situation. But another part of her, a part she barely acknowledged, was responding to something else entirely. The way he looked at her, the way he'd protected her without hesitation, the quiet strength in his voice when he spoke her name. Why should I trust you? She asked. How do I know you're not just another man trying to use me for your own purposes? Ethan's expression softened. You don't know that. All I can tell you is that I've spent 2 years watching Blackwood destroy innocent people, and I won't let him destroy you. Whether you choose to stay married to me or not, I'll make sure you and your father are safe and financially secure. Samuel cleared his throat. Even if we agreed to this plan, how do we know Blackwood will participate in a public auction? He's not the type to submit to that kind of spectacle, because his pride won't let him back down from a challenge, especially not in front of the entire valley. Men like Blackwood need to be seen as powerful, untouchable. If word spreads that someone is willing to bid against him for Clara, he'll have to respond or risk looking weak. And how exactly do we spread that word? Clara asked. Ethan smiled. For the first time since she'd met him, and the expression transformed his entire face. Leave that to me. I've got connections in town who'll make sure the news reaches the right ears. Clara looked at her father, seeing her own uncertainty reflected in his eyes. They were being asked to trust a stranger with their lives and their future, to gamble everything on a plan that could just as easily backfire and leave them worse off than before. But what choice did they really have? Blackwood's deadline was tonight, and his threats were all too real. At least Ethan's plan offered them some hope of escaping with their dignity and their independence intact. "If we do this," Clara said slowly, "and you win the auction, what exactly would you expect from me as your wife?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications neither of them was ready to address directly. Ethan's expression grew serious again. "I would expect nothing more than your friendship and your help in bringing Blackwood to justice. Beyond that, any relationship between us would develop naturally, or not at all, based on our mutual feelings." Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks at the careful way he phrased his answer. There was respect in it, but also possibility. A door left open for something more if they both chose to walk through it. "Papa?" she asked, looking to her father for guidance. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving between Clara and Ethan. Finally, he sighed and reached across the table to take his daughter's hand. "It's your choice, sweetheart. You're old enough to make your own decisions about your future. But if you ask my opinion, I'd rather see you married to a man who treats you with respect than handed over to a monster like Blackwood." Clara squeezed her father's hand, then looked back at Ethan. "All right, Mr. Cross, we'll try your plan. But I have one condition. Name it. If this goes wrong, if Blackwood retaliates or if your plan puts my father in danger, I want your word that you'll get him to safety, even if it means abandoning whatever vendetta you have against Blackwood." Ethan nodded without hesitation. "You have my word, Miss Whitmore. Your father's safety comes first." The rest of the morning passed in a blur of preparation. Ethan rode into Redstone Creek to spread word of the auction and make the necessary arrangements, while Clara and Samuel tried to go about their normal routine, despite the tension that filled the air like electricity before a storm. Clara found herself unable to concentrate on her usual tasks. Her mind kept drifting to Ethan Cross, to the revelation that he was a former marshal seeking justice for his murdered brother. She thought about the way he'd looked at her when he'd promised to protect her, the careful respect in his voice when he'd explained what their marriage would mean. She'd never expected to marry for love. In her practical way, she'd always assumed she'd eventually choose a husband based on compatibility and mutual respect. Love was a luxury that ranch women couldn't always afford. But something about Ethan stirred feelings in her that she'd never experienced before, a mixture of attraction and admiration that made her pulse quicken whenever he was near. Around midday, Samuel came to find her in the kitchen, where she was mechanically kneading bread dough with more force than necessary. "You're going to work that dough to death," he observed, settling into a chair at the table. Clara paused in her kneading, realizing that her movements had become almost violent in their intensity. "I can't stop thinking about tonight. What if this doesn't work? What if Blackwood sees through the plan? Then we'll face whatever comes next, just like we always have," Samuel said gently. "But Clara, I want you to know that I'm proud of you. Not many women would have the courage to do what you're doing." "I'm terrified, Papa." "I know, sweetheart. But sometimes being brave doesn't mean not being scared. Sometimes it means being scared and doing what's right anyway." Clara wiped her flour-covered hands on her apron and sat down across from her father. "What do you think of him? Of Ethan, I mean?" Samuel considered the question carefully. "I think he's a man carrying a heavy burden, someone who's been hurt and is trying to make things right the only way he knows how. I also think he looks at you like you're something precious, something worth protecting. You notice that too. I'd have to be blind not to. The question is, how do you feel about him?" Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks again. "I barely know him, Papa. We only met yesterday." Sometimes knowing someone has less to do with time than with understanding, Samuel replied. Your mother and I knew we were meant for each other after one conversation. Not saying that's what's happening here, but don't dismiss your feelings just because they're new. Before Clara could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention. Through the kitchen window, they could see Ethan riding hard toward the house, his expression grim. He pulled up at the front porch and dismounted quickly, striding toward the house with urgent purpose. Samuel and Clara met him at the door. It's done, Ethan said without preamble. Word is spreading through town about the auction. It's set for 7 o'clock tonight at the Silver Dollar Saloon. Did Blackwood respond? Samuel asked. Oh, he responded all right. He's furious. Martha Kane says he stormed into the saloon an hour ago, demanding to know who was behind this insult to his honor. When she told him, it was a stranger who'd put up enough gold to make the auction legitimate. He swore he'd crush anyone who dared bid against him. Clara felt a chill run down her spine. So he'll be there? He'll be there. And he won't be alone. Martha says he's already sent for more men from his other properties. This won't be a simple auction, Miss Whitmore. It's going to be a showdown. Samuel reached for his rifle. Then maybe we should rethink this plan. No, Clara said firmly, surprising herself with the strength in her voice. We've come this far. I won't back down now and let that monster think he can intimidate us into submission. Ethan studied her face, something like admiration flickering in his eyes. Are you sure? Once we walk into that saloon tonight, there's no turning back. Clara lifted her chin, feeling a surge of determination that reminded her of her mother's quiet strength. I'm sure, Mr. Cross. Let's go show Victor Blackwood that the Whitmore family doesn't give up without a fight. As the afternoon shadows grew longer, Clara found herself alternating between nervous energy and moments of strange calm. She changed into her best dress, a deep green silk that had belonged to her mother, and pinned her hair up in an elegant style that made her look older and more sophisticated than her 22 years. When she came downstairs, both men stopped talking and stared. Samuel's eyes grew misty as he saw his late wife reflected in their daughter's face, while Ethan's expression was harder to read, but no less intense. You look beautiful, sweetheart, Samuel said softly. Thank you, Papa. Clara turned to Ethan. Will this do for an auction, Mr. Cross? You look perfect, Ethan replied, his voice slightly husky. But remember, no matter what happens tonight, you're not property to be bought and sold. You're a woman making a choice about her own future. The reminder steadied Clara's nerves. She was choosing this path, choosing to trust this enigmatic man with her future. Whatever happened at the Silver Dollar Saloon, she would face it with dignity and courage. As they prepared to leave for town, Ethan pulled Samuel aside for a private conversation. Clara couldn't hear their words, but she saw her father nod grimly and check his sidearm before joining them at the wagon. The ride to Redstone Creek passed in tense silence, each of them lost in their own thoughts about what the evening might bring. As they crested the hill overlooking the town, Clara could see that word of the auction had indeed spread. The Silver Dollar Saloon was surrounded by horses and wagons, and people moved through the streets with the excited energy of a crowd gathering for a spectacle. Last chance to change your mind, Ethan said quietly, his eyes fixed on the bustling scene. Below, Clara took a deep breath, feeling her mother's strength flowing through her like a benediction. I'm ready, Mr. Cross. Let's go make some history. The Silver Dollar Saloon had never seen a crowd like this one. Men who hadn't spoken to each other in years stood shoulder to shoulder, united by curiosity and the promise of witnessing something that would be talked about for generations. The air was thick with tobacco smoke and anticipation, while the warm glow of oil lamps cast dancing shadows across weathered faces and polished wood. Martha Kane stood behind the bar, her gray hair pinned back severely and her sharp eyes taking in every detail of the unusual gathering. She'd run the Silver Dollar for 15 years, serving drinks to ranchers, miners, and drifters, but she'd never presided over anything quite like this. The mahogany bar that usually hosted friendly games of poker and boisterous conversations about cattle prices had been cleared to serve as an auction block, complete with a wooden gavel that had been borrowed from the courthouse. Clara walked through the swinging doors, flanked by her father and Ethan, her head held high despite the way every conversation seemed to stop as they entered. She could feel dozens of eyes examining her, appraising her like they might evaluate a prize heifer, and she had to fight down the urge to turn around and run back to the safety of the ranch. The crowd parted to create a narrow pathway toward the front of the room, and Clara was acutely aware of the whispered comments that followed in their wake. Some of the voices were sympathetic, acknowledging the impossible position she'd been placed in, while others carried the cruel edge of gossip and speculation. "That's her, all right," she heard someone mutter. "Pretty enough, I suppose, but not worth bankrupting yourself over." "Heard Blackwood's been after that land for years," another voice added. "This whole thing's just business search up as romance." Ethan's hand brushed against her elbow, a gesture so subtle that only she noticed it, but it provided exactly the reassurance she needed. She glanced at him sideways and saw that his attention was focused on the crowd, his eyes constantly moving as he assessed potential threats and planned escape routes. Samuel walked on her other side, his face set in grim lines but his shoulders squared with paternal pride. Whatever reservations he might have about this plan, he was committed to seeing it through, and his presence gave Clara the courage she needed to keep putting one foot in front of the other. The crowd near the bar was thinner, allowing Clara to see the setup more clearly. A small platform had been constructed in front of the mahogany counter, just high enough to ensure that everyone in the room would have a clear view of the proceedings. 2 chairs had been placed to one side for her and Samuel, while Martha Kane stood ready with her borrowed gavel and a leather-bound ledger to record the bids. But it was the figure standing near the back wall that made Clara's blood run cold. Victor Blackwood was exactly as imposing as she remembered from their few encounters in town. Tall and broad-shouldered, with steel-gray hair and eyes like chips of winter ice. He wore an expensive black suit with a gold watch chain draped across his vest, and everything about him radiated wealth and power. He wasn't alone. 4 men flanked him, all carrying themselves with the dangerous confidence of professional gunfighters. Clara recognized Jake Morrison from the previous night, his mean face split by a cold smile as he met her gaze across the room. The others were strangers, but they had the same predatory look that marked them as men who solved problems with violence. Blackwood himself seemed completely at ease, as if he were attending a social gathering rather than an auction for a woman's hand in marriage. He nodded politely to acquaintances in the crowd and even smiled at something one of his companions whispered in his ear. But Clara noticed that his eyes never left her for more than a few seconds, studying her with the calculating gaze of a man evaluating his future property. Martha Kane rapped her gavel against the bar, and the conversations gradually died away, until the saloon was silent except for the sound of breathing and the occasional creak of floorboards. She cleared her throat and opened her ledger with ceremonial precision. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed room, "we're here tonight for a most unusual occasion. Miss Clara Whitmore, daughter of Samuel Whitmore of the Whitmore Ranch, has consented to be married by auction, with her hand going to the highest bidder." A murmur ran through the crowd at the formal announcement. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she kept her expression composed and her gaze fixed on a point somewhere above the heads of the assembled men. "The terms are simple," Martha continued. "Bidding will start at $100, and each bid must exceed the previous by at least $10. Payment is due in full immediately upon conclusion of the auction, and the wedding will take place tomorrow morning at the Redstone Creek Church." Clara noticed that Martha made no mention of Blackwood's original arrangement with her father, presenting this as a voluntary auction rather than a desperate attempt to escape an impossible situation. It was a small kindness, but one that helped preserve what remained of Clara's dignity. "Before we begin," Martha added, "Miss Whitmore would like to say a few words." This hadn't been part of the plan, but Clara found herself standing and stepping onto the small platform. The room fell completely silent as she looked out over the sea of faces, some curious, some sympathetic, and some frankly hostile. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest, "I want you to understand that while I am here by choice, I am not a piece of property to be bought and sold. Whoever wins this auction will be gaining a wife, not a servant. I expect to be treated with respect and kindness, and I will offer the same in return." She paused, her gaze finding Blackwood's cold eyes across the room. "I also want it understood that this marriage will be a true partnership. I have experience running a ranch, managing accounts, and making difficult decisions. I will not be relegated to the kitchen and the sewing room while my husband makes all the important choices." A few men in the crowd chuckled at this declaration, but Clara noticed that most of them seemed impressed by her directness. Even some of Blackwood's supporters appeared to be reconsidering their assumptions about the quiet Whitmore girl. Finally, Clara continued, her voice growing stronger, "I want to remind everyone here that this auction represents a new beginning, not just for me but for Copper Ridge Valley. The man who wins my hand will be gaining not just a wife, but a partner in building something better for this community." She stepped down from the platform to scattered applause, her heart pounding but her confidence restored. Whatever happened next, she had made her position clear. She would not be a passive victim in this arrangement. Martha raised her gavel again. "Thank you, Miss Whitmore. Now shall we begin? Do I hear an opening bid of $100? "100, called a voice from the middle of the room. Clara recognized Tom Bradley, a local rancher who had always been friendly to her family. His bid seemed genuine rather than strategic, and she felt a flash of gratitude for his participation. "110, came another voice, this one from near the door. 120, 130. The bidding started slowly, with several local men offering modest increases that seemed more like gestures of respect than serious attempts to win. Clara found herself studying each bidder, trying to imagine what her life might be like with any of them. Some were men she'd known since childhood, solid and reliable but lacking the spark that might make a marriage truly fulfilling. As the bids climbed toward $200, the number of participants began to dwindle. This was more money than most of the local ranchers could spare, especially in times as hard as these. One by one, they dropped out with regretful shakes of their heads, leaving only the serious contenders. $250, called a new voice, and Clara felt her blood chill as she recognized Blackwood's smooth baritone. He had entered the bidding casually, almost dismissively, as if the amount were pocket change to him. Which, Clara realized, it probably was. The man's wealth was legendary throughout the territory, built on a combination of successful investments, ruthless business practices, and what many suspected were outright criminal activities. The room fell silent after Blackwood's bid. $250 was more than most men in Copper Ridge Valley saw in a year, and everyone knew that the land baron could easily go much higher if necessary. Clara saw the defeat in the faces of the remaining bidders and felt her heart sink. Had their plan failed before it even really began? $260, said a quiet voice from near the front of the room. Every head turned to look at Ethan Cross, who stood with his thumbs hooked in his gun belt and his expression calm as still water. He looked completely relaxed, as if he were bidding on a saddle rather than a woman's future. Blackwood's eyes narrowed as he studied this unexpected challenger. "I don't believe we've been introduced," he said, his voice carrying easily through the silent room. "Name's Cross, Ethan Cross. And what brings you to our little community, Mr. Cross?" Ethan smiled, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. Just passing through. Heard there was some interesting business being conducted tonight. Indeed. Blackwood's gaze moved from Ethan to Clara and back again. 270. 300, Ethan replied without hesitation. A collective gasp ran through the crowd. $300 was approaching the realm of fantasy for most of the men present, an amount that represented months or even years of careful saving. Clara found herself staring at Ethan in amazement, wondering just how much money he was prepared to spend on this gamble. Blackwood's expression darkened slightly, but his voice remained controlled. 350. 400. 450. 500. The bidding continued in steady increments, each man's voice growing tighter as the amounts climbed beyond anything the assembled crowd had ever witnessed. Clara watched Blackwood's face carefully, looking for signs that he was approaching his limit, but the man's poker face was legendary for good reason. At $800, Blackwood paused for the first time, his eyes calculating as he studied Ethan with new interest. "You seem remarkably well-funded for a drifter, Mr. Cross." "I've been fortunate in my investments," Ethan replied mildly. "Indeed. 850. 900. $1,000. The silence that followed Blackwood's bid was profound. $1,000 was enough to buy a small ranch, complete with livestock and equipment. It was an amount that demonstrated not just wealth, but a determination to win at any cost. Clara felt her hands trembling in her lap. Even if Ethan had that kind of money, which seemed increasingly unlikely, what would it mean for their future? Together, how could any marriage built on such a foundation ever hope to succeed? Ethan seemed to be considering his options, his face giving away nothing of his thoughts. The crowd held its collective breath, waiting to see if this mysterious stranger would continue his challenge or admit defeat. 1,100, Ethan said finally, his voice as calm as if he were ordering a drink. Now it was Blackwood's turn. To pause, Clara could see the wheels turning behind his cold eyes as he reassessed both his opponent and the situation. This wasn't going according to his plan, and men like Victor Blackwood didn't react well to unexpected developments. 1,200, he said, his voice slightly strained for the first time. 1,300. 1,400. 1,500. Clara realized she was holding her breath. The amounts being discussed were staggering, more money than she had ever imagined being spent on anything, let alone on her. Part of her was flattered by the demonstration of her perceived value, but a larger part was terrified by the implications of such a high price. Blackwood was no longer looking relaxed. His jaw was tight, and Clara could see a vein pulsing in his temple. He was still far from broke, but even for a man of his wealth, $1,500 was a significant sum to spend on what was essentially a matter of pride. 1,600, he said, his voice clipped. $2,000. The words fell into the silence like stones into still water. Clara gasped audibly, unable to believe what she had just heard. $2,000 was enough to buy 3 or 4 good ranches, enough to set up a man for life in comfort and security. Blackwood stared at Ethan with unconcealed shock and growing anger. His carefully maintained composure was beginning to crack, revealing the violent temper that lurked beneath his polished exterior. "That's quite a sum for a drifter," he said slowly. "I told you, I've been fortunate. Perhaps too fortunate. Tell me, Mr. Cross, what line of work provides such remarkable returns?" Ethan's smile was sharp as a blade. "I collect bounties, Mr. Blackwood, on men who think they're above the law." The implication hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Clara saw Blackwood's hand move instinctively toward his coat, where she suspected he carried a weapon, but he caught himself before completing the gesture. "That's a dangerous profession," Blackwood said quietly. "Only for men with guilty consciences." The tension in the room was so thick Clara felt she could cut it with a knife. The two men stared at each other across the crowded saloon, and she realized that this had stopped being about money or even about her. This was about power, about justice, about settling old scores that went far deeper than a simple auction. Martha Kane seemed to sense that the situation was spiraling beyond her control. She raised her gavel nervously and cleared her throat. "Do I hear any counter to $2,000? She asked, her voice slightly shaky. Blackwood continued to stare at Ethan for a long moment, his face a mask of barely controlled rage. Clara could see him weighing his options, calculating whether this mysterious bounty hunter represented a threat that needed to be eliminated or merely an annoyance, to be brushed aside. $2,500, he said finally, his voice dripping with menace. Ethan didn't even blink. 3,000. Now Blackwood's composure cracked completely. His face flushed red with anger, and his hand went openly to the gun at his side. Several of his men shifted position, their own hands moving toward their weapons. "That's enough," Blackwood snarled. "I don't know what game you're playing, Cross, but it ends now." Ethan's own hand moved to rest casually on the butt of his Colt. "The only game I'm playing is the one you started, Blackwood. You wanted an auction, you got one. Don't blame me if you can't afford the stakes." "I can afford anything in this miserable territory," Blackwood snapped. "The question is whether you can afford to live long enough to collect your prize." The threat was open now, hanging in the air for everyone to hear. Clara saw several men in the crowd begin to edge toward the exits, sensing that violence was about to erupt. But Ethan seemed completely unperturbed by the danger. "Are you threatening me in front of all these witnesses, Mr. Blackwood?" he asked mildly. "That doesn't seem very smart for a man who likes to keep his business dealings." "Quiet." Blackwood's eyes darted around the room, suddenly aware that his temper had led him to expose himself in front of half the valley. His reputation depended on maintaining the facade of a legitimate businessman, and making open threats in a crowded saloon was exactly the kind of mistake that could destroy that carefully constructed image. With visible effort, he forced his hand away from his gun and smoothed his expression back into something resembling calm. But Clara could see the fury still burning in his eyes, and she knew that this confrontation was far from over. $3,000 is my final offer, he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. All eyes turned to Ethan, waiting to see if he would continue this deadly game or finally admit defeat. Clara found herself leaning forward slightly, her heart pounding as she waited for his response. Ethan was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving slowly around the room before settling on Clara's face. When their eyes met, she saw something there that made her breath catch. Not just determination or defiance, but something deeper. Something that looked almost like $4,000, he said quietly, never taking his eyes off Clara. The crowd erupted in excited murmurs and gasps. $4,000 was a fortune, an amount that represented wealth beyond the dreams of most frontier families. Clara felt dizzy at the thought that someone was willing to pay such a sum for her hand in marriage. Blackwood stood frozen for a moment, his face cycling through a range of emotions from shock to rage to something that might have been fear. $4,000 was serious money even for him, especially for what was supposed to be a simple business transaction. But more than the money, Clara realized this represented a direct challenge to his authority in Copper Ridge Valley. If he backed down now, if he allowed this stranger to outbid him in front of the entire community, his reputation as an untouchable power broker would be permanently damaged. 5,000, he said through gritted teeth. Ethan smiled, and Clara realized with a shock that he had been waiting for exactly this moment. Everything that had happened so far had been carefully orchestrated to push Blackwood to this point, to make him so angry and desperate that he would commit himself beyond any reasonable limit. $10,000, Ethan said calmly. The silence that followed was absolute. $10,000 was more money than most people in the territory would see in their entire lifetimes. It was enough to buy a small town, complete with all the businesses and surrounding ranch land. Blackwood stood perfectly still, his face completely white except for 2 spots of color high on his cheeks. Clara could see his hands shaking with rage, and she suddenly realized that Ethan had pushed the man beyond his breaking point. "You son of a bitch," Blackwood whispered, his voice carrying clearly in the silent room. "You think you can come into my territory and make a fool of me?" His hand went to his gun, and this time there was no hesitation. Clara screamed as the weapon cleared leather, but Ethan was already moving. His own Colt appeared in his hand. With lightning speed, the barrel pointing steadily at Blackwood's chest. "I wouldn't," Ethan said quietly. "Not with all these witnesses." For a moment that felt like an eternity, the 2 men stood frozen in their deadly tableau. Clara could hear her own heart pounding in her ears, and she was dimly aware that several other guns had appeared in the hands of Blackwood's men. Then Martha Kane's voice cut through the tension like a whip crack. "The next man who draws a weapon in my establishment will answer to this," she declared. And Clara looked up to see the saloon owner holding a double-barreled shotgun pointed at the ceiling. "This is an auction, not a gunfight. You want to kill each other, you can do it outside." The intervention gave both men a face-saving opportunity to step back from the brink. Ethan holstered his weapon first, his movements deliberate and controlled. After a moment's hesitation, Blackwood followed suit, though his eyes never left Ethan's face. $10,000 is the current bid," Martha announced, her voice steady despite the tension. "Do I hear any counteroffers?" Blackwood stared at Ethan for another long moment, his face a mask of frustrated rage. Clara could see him calculating, weighing his options, trying to decide whether to escalate the confrontation or cut his losses. "This isn't over," he said finally, his voice low and deadly. "No," Ethan agreed, "it's not." Blackwood turned on his heel and strode toward the exit, his men falling into step behind him. But as he reached the swinging doors, he paused and looked back at Clara. "Enjoy your victory, Miss Whitmore," he said, his voice dripping with false courtesy. "I hope it proves to be everything you dreamed of." The threat in his words was unmistakable, and Clara felt a chill run down her spine as he disappeared into the night. She had a feeling that their troubles with Victor Blackwood were just beginning. Martha Kane waited until the sound of hoofbeats had faded before raising her gavel one final time. "Going once, going twice," she paused dramatically. "Sold to Mr. Ethan Cross for $10,000. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause, but Clara barely heard them. She was staring at Ethan in amazement, trying to process what had just happened. This stranger had just spent a fortune to save her from Blackwood's clutches, and she didn't even know why. Ethan walked over to where she sat and offered her his hand. "Miss Whitmore," he said formally, "it would be my honor if you would consent to be my wife." Clara looked into his storm-gray eyes and saw sincerity there, along with something else that made her pulse quicken. Whatever his reasons for this elaborate gamble, she sensed that they went far beyond simple strategy or revenge. "Yes, Mr. Cross," she said, placing her hand in his, "I will marry you." As their fingers intertwined, Clara felt a shock of awareness that had nothing to do with the dramatic events of the evening. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, she allowed herself to consider the possibility that this marriage might become something more than a business arrangement. But even as Ethan squeezed her hand gently and smiled down at her, Clara couldn't shake the memory of Blackwood's parting words. The man who had just become her husband-to-be had made a powerful enemy tonight, and she had a feeling that the price of their freedom would be higher than even $10,000 could cover. Dawn broke over Copper Ridge Valley with the kind of golden light that made even the harshest landscape look like a painting. Clara stood at her bedroom window, still, wearing the green silk dress from the night before, watching the sun climb over the distant mesas. She hadn't slept, couldn't sleep, not with everything that had happened swirling through her mind like a dust devil. The auction felt like something from a fever dream. $10,000. The amount was so staggering that she kept repeating it to herself, trying to make it feel real. In one evening, her entire life had changed course as dramatically as a river diverted by an avalanche. She was going to marry a man she'd known for barely 2 days, a man who had just spent a fortune. To claim her hand. The sound of voices from the kitchen below drew her attention. Ethan had spent the night in the bunkhouse again, but apparently he was already up and talking with her father. Clara pressed her ear to the floor, trying to catch fragments of their conversation, but could only make out the low rumble of masculine voices punctuated by the occasional scrape of a chair or clink of a coffee cup. She moved away from the window and caught sight of herself in the mirror above her dresser. Her hair had come loose from its pins during the long sleepless night, and her dress was wrinkled from sitting curled in the chair by the window. She looked like exactly what she was, a woman whose world had been turned upside down in the space of a few hours. But as she studied her reflection more closely, Clara realized that something fundamental had shifted inside her. The frightened girl who had been dragged from her bed by Blackwood's men was gone, replaced by someone harder and more determined. She had faced down a room full of men, spoken her mind publicly, and chosen her own fate. Whatever came next, she would meet it with her head held high. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. "Clara?" her father's voice called. "Are you awake?" "Come in, Papa." Samuel entered carrying a steaming cup of coffee, his face showing the strain of a sleepless night spent worrying about his daughter's future. He handed her the cup and settled into the chair she had vacated. "How are you feeling this morning?" he asked gently. Clara took a sip of the strong black coffee, grateful for its warmth and familiar taste. "Like I've been run over by a stampede," she admitted. "Everything feels different somehow." "That's understandable. You've made a big decision, sweetheart. Probably the biggest one of your life." "Have I made the right one?" The question burst out of her before she could stop it. "Papa, what do I really know about Ethan Cross? He could be anyone, could want anything from me." Samuel was quiet for a moment, considering his words carefully. "I've been talking with him this morning, trying to get a better sense of the man. You're going to marry. What I can tell you is that he's not what he appears to be on the surface." "What do you mean?" "He's educated, Clara, really educated. The way he talks, the things he knows. This isn't some drifter who learned to read from dime novels. And the money he spent last night, that wasn't his life savings. He's got resources, connections, a past that he's not ready to share completely." Clara felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. "Did he tell you anything else about why he's really here?" "Some. Enough to convince me that his hatred for Blackwood is real and justified. But there's more to it than just revenge for his brother's death. I think Ethan Cross is the kind of man who can't stand by and watch innocent people suffer when he has the power to help them." "And you think that's what he's doing?" "Helping." "U.S.?" Samuel reached over and took her hand. "I think he saw a beautiful, brave young woman in an impossible situation, and he decided to do something about it. The question is whether you can learn to care for him in return." Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Papa, I barely know the man, but you're attracted to him." It wasn't a question, and Clara found she couldn't deny it. There was something about Ethan Cross that drew her like a moth to flame. The way he moved with such quiet confidence, the intensity in his gray eyes when he looked at her, the gentle strength in his voice when he spoke her name. "That doesn't mean anything," she said weakly. "It means everything, sweetheart. Physical. Attraction can grow into something deeper if there's respect and kindness to build on. And from what I've seen, Ethan Cross respects you more than any man who's ever shown interest." Before Clara could respond, another knock came at the door. This time it was Ethan's voice calling her name. "Miss Whitmore? I hate to disturb you, but we need to discuss the arrangements for today." Clara looked down at her wrinkled dress and loose hair. "I'm not really presentable right now." "Neither am I," came the reply, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "I've been up since before dawn checking the perimeter and making sure we don't have any unwelcome visitors." Samuel stood and moved toward the door. "I'll leave you two to talk. But Clara, remember what I said. Sometimes the best things in life come disguised as the scariest." When her father had gone downstairs, Clara opened her bedroom door to find Ethan standing in the hallway. He had indeed been up early. His clothes showed signs of hard riding, and there was dust on his boots and hat. But his eyes were alert and focused, scanning her face as if trying to read her thoughts. "How are you this morning?" he asked, his voice gentle, confused, nervous, grateful. Clara realized she was twisting her hands together and forced herself to stop. "I keep thinking about what happened last night and wondering if I'm dreaming." "It was real," Ethan said softly. "All of it. And this morning, if you're still willing, we're going to make it official. The wedding. Reverend Phillips is expecting us at 10 o'clock. It'll be a simple ceremony, just the legal requirements to make everything binding." Clara studied his face, looking for any sign of regret or second thoughts. "Are you having doubts, Mr. Cross?" "Ethan," he corrected. "And no, I'm not having doubts, are you?" The honest answer was that she was terrified, but not in the way he probably meant. She wasn't afraid of marrying him. She was afraid of the feelings he stirred up in her, afraid of hoping for something more than the practical arrangement they had discussed. "No doubts," she said finally. "But I do have questions. Ask them. Last night, when you bid against Blackwood, that wasn't just about helping my family, was it? There was something personal between you two." Ethan leaned against the doorframe, his expression growing serious. "Victor Blackwood has been destroying lives for years, always staying just inside the bounds of the law or buying his way out of trouble when he crossed the line. My brother Marcus was just one of many good men who died because Blackwood wanted something they had. And you think he'll try to retaliate for what happened last night? I know he will. Men like Blackwood don't forgive public humiliation, especially not when it comes from someone they see as beneath them." "But Clara—" He stepped closer, and she caught the scent of leather and sage that seemed to cling to him. "I want you to know that I'll do everything in my power to keep you safe. Whatever it costs, whatever it takes." The intensity in his voice made her breath catch. "Even if it means putting yourself in danger? Especially then." They stood looking at each other in the narrow hallway, and Clara felt the air between them crackling with unspoken possibilities. She was acutely aware of how close he was standing, how the morning light from the window at the end of the hall caught the gray flecks in his eyes. "I should get ready," she said, her voice slightly breathless. "Of course, I'll be downstairs when you're ready to go." As he turned to leave, Clara called after him. "Ethan?" He paused and looked back at her. "Thank you for everything." His smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "Thank you for saying yes." An hour later, Clara stood before her mirror again, this time wearing her mother's wedding dress. The ivory silk had yellowed slightly with age, but it still fit perfectly, hugging her curves in all the right places before flowing out into an elegant train. The dress had been packed away in tissue paper for years, waiting for this day, though Clara had never imagined it would come under these circumstances. She had pinned her hair up in an elaborate style that left soft tendrils framing her face, and she wore her mother's pearl earrings and necklace. Looking at herself, she could almost see her mother's spirit in the reflection, offering silent encouragement for the journey ahead. Samuel knocked and entered without waiting for permission, stopping short when he saw her. "My God," he whispered, "you look exactly like your mother did on our wedding day." Clara turned to face him, smoothing the silk skirt with nervous hands. "Do you think she would approve of what I'm doing?" "I think she would be proud of your courage," Samuel said firmly. "Your mother was never one to back down from a challenge, and she had excellent judgment about people. If she were here, I believe she would like Ethan Cross very much. He's a good man, isn't he, Papa? I believe so, sweetheart. But more importantly, I think he's a man who will value what he's getting in you. They made their way downstairs. Together, Clara lifting her skirts carefully to avoid tripping on the train. Ethan was waiting in the front parlor, and when he turned to see her, his expression took her breath away. He had cleaned up considerably since their hallway conversation, wearing a dark suit that emphasized his broad shoulders and lean build. His hair was combed back neatly, and he had shaved, revealing the strong line of his jaw. But it was the look in his eyes that made Clara's heart skip a beat. He was staring at her as if she were something precious and miraculous, something he had never expected to find. "You're beautiful," he said simply, his voice rough with emotion. "Thank you," Clara managed, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. They rode to town in Samuel's wagon, with Ethan's horse tied behind. The morning was crisp and clear, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. Under other circumstances, it would have been a perfect day for a wedding. Redstone Creek was unusually quiet as they made their way down the main street toward the church. Clara noticed curtains twitching in windows and faces peering out from doorways, but most people seemed to be keeping their distance. She wondered if word of Blackwood's threats had spread, making the townspeople nervous about being seen associating with the newlyweds. The church was a simple wooden structure with a bell tower and stained glass windows that cast colored light across the rough wooden pews. Reverend Phillips met them at the door, a kindly man in his 60s who had known Clara since she was a child. "Miss Whitmore," he said warmly, taking her hands in his. "You look lovely, my dear. Are you ready for this?" "As ready as I can be, Reverend." He turned to Ethan with a more measuring gaze. "And you, young man? Marriage is a serious commitment, not to be entered into lightly." "I understand that, sir," Ethan replied. "I don't take this responsibility lightly." The Reverend nodded, apparently satisfied by something he saw in Ethan's face. "Very well. Shall we begin?" The ceremony was indeed simple, just the basic vows required by territorial law to make the marriage legal and binding. But as Clara stood beside Ethan in the colored light streaming from the stained glass windows, she found herself moved by the ancient words and their timeless promises. "Do you, Ethan Cross, take Clara Whitmore to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Ethan said, his voice strong and clear. "And do you, Clara Whitmore, take Ethan Cross to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live?" Clara looked into Ethan's gray eyes and saw sincerity there, along with something that might have been the beginning of deeper feelings. "I do," she whispered. "Then by the power vested in me by the territory of Arizona, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride." Clara's heart began to race as Ethan stepped closer. This would be their first kiss, the seal on their unexpected union. She tilted her face up toward his, her eyes fluttering closed as his hands came up to frame her face. When his lips touched hers, it was gentle and reverent, but Clara felt a shock of awareness run through her entire body. This wasn't the perfunctory kiss of a business arrangement. There was real emotion behind it, real desire carefully held in check. When they broke apart, Clara found herself staring up at Ethan in wonder. His eyes had darkened, and she could see that the kiss had affected him as much as it had her. "Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Cross," Reverend Phillips said warmly. "May God bless your union." As they signed the marriage certificate and completed the legal requirements, Clara found herself stealing glances at her new husband. The reality of what they had just done was beginning to sink in. She was married. She was Mrs. Ethan Cross, bound to this enigmatic man by law and sacred vows. They emerged from the church into bright sunshine, and Clara was surprised to see A small crowd gathered in the street. Word of the wedding had spread, and it seemed that half the town had turned out to witness the conclusion of the previous night's drama. "Congratulations, Mrs. Cross," called Martha Kane from the crowd. "Best wishes," added Tom Bradley, the rancher who had placed the first bid at the auction. Clara smiled and waved, grateful for the show of support from the community. But even as she acknowledged their well wishes, she noticed that several people kept glancing nervously up and down the street, as if expecting trouble. Ethan must have noticed it too, because his hand moved protectively to the small of her back as they made their way toward the wagon. "We should head back to the ranch," he said quietly. "The sooner we're on familiar ground, the better." Clara nodded, understanding his caution. Blackwood might be many things, but he wasn't the type to let last night's humiliation pass without some form of retaliation. The question was when and how he would strike back. As Samuel helped her up onto the wagon seat, Clara caught sight of a familiar figure watching from the shadows between two buildings. Jake Morrison, one of Blackwood's men, was making no effort to hide his presence. His cold stare sent a chill down Clara's spine, and she was grateful when Ethan climbed up beside her and took the reins. They left town at a steady pace, not hurrying, but not dawdling either. Clara found herself hyper-aware of every sound, every movement in her peripheral vision. The joy she had felt during the ceremony was gradually being replaced by a growing sense of unease. "He's following us," Ethan said quietly, confirming her fears. Clara glanced back and saw a lone rider keeping pace with them, about a quarter-mile behind. "What do you think he wants?" "To see where we're going, probably. To report back to his boss about our movements and defenses." Samuel, who was riding alongside the wagon on his own horse, had also noticed their tail. "Should we try to lose him?" "No point," Ethan replied. "He already knows where the ranch is. Better to let him think we're not worried about him." "But—" Clara could see the tension in her new husband's shoulders, the way his eyes constantly scanned the landscape around them for signs of additional threats. Whatever he might say about not being worried, he was clearly taking the situation very seriously. The ride back to the ranch seemed to take forever, but finally the familiar buildings came into view. Clara felt some of her tension ease as they pulled into the yard. This was home, the place where she had grown up, where she felt safe and secure. But even that comfort was short-lived. As they climbed down from the wagon, one of the ranch hands came running from the direction of the barn. "Mr. Whitmore," he called breathlessly. "You need to see this." Samuel hurried toward the barn with Ethan and Clara close behind. What they found there made Clara's blood run cold. Someone had been busy while they were in town. The hay in the barn had been soaked with coal oil, ready to burn at the touch of a match. Several of the horses showed signs of having been spooked, and one of the water troughs had been poisoned with something that left a oily film on the surface. "When did this happen?" Ethan demanded. "Must have been while we were all in town." "For the wedding," the ranch hand replied. "Tommy and I came back to find it like this. Whoever did it knew exactly when we'd be gone." Ethan's jaw was tight with anger. "How many men do you have working here, Samuel?" "Just 3, including Tommy. It's all I can afford these days." "That's not enough. Not if Blackwood decides to escalate things." Clara felt a growing sense of dread. "You think he'll attack the ranch directly?" "I think he'll do whatever it takes to get what he wants," Ethan replied grimly. "And right. Now what he wants is to prove that marrying you was a mistake that will cost everyone involved." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of hoofbeats announced the arrival of more riders. Clara's heart sank as she recognized the group approaching the ranch house. Blackwood himself rode at the head of a dozen armed men, his face set in lines of cold fury. They reined in just outside the fence that surrounded the main house, close enough to be clearly threatening, but far enough away to maintain the pretense of legality. Blackwood's pale eyes swept over the small group gathered in the barnyard before, settling on Clara with predatory intensity. "Congratulations on your wedding, Mrs. Cross," he called out, his voice dripping with false courtesy. "I do hope you'll be very happy together." "What do you want, Blackwood?" Samuel demanded, his hand resting on his rifle. "Why, I've come to welcome the newlyweds, of course, and to discuss a little business proposition." Ethan stepped forward, positioning himself between Clara and the mounted men. "We're not interested in any business you might have to offer." Blackwood's smile was cold as winter. "Oh, I think you might be, Mr. Cross. You see, it seems there's been some confusion about the ownership of this property. My lawyers have been doing some research, and they've discovered some irregularities in the Whitmore family's claim to this land." Clara felt her knees go weak. "What are you talking about?" "It appears that your grandfather never properly filed his original homestead claim. A simple oversight, I'm sure, but one that calls into question your family's legal right to this property. My lawyers are prepared to file a claim of their own, based on some prior documentation we've uncovered." "You're lying," Samuel said flatly. "Am I?" "We'll let the territorial court decide, shall we?" "Of course, legal proceedings can be expensive and time-consuming. A poor rancher might find himself bankrupt long before the case is resolved, especially if he has trouble finding witnesses willing to testify on his behalf." The threat was clear. Blackwood had the money and influence too. Tie them up in court for years, bleeding them dry with legal fees while making life difficult for anyone who tried to help them. "However," Blackwood continued, "I'm prepared to be reasonable. Mrs. Cross, if you were to reconsider your recent marriage and accept my original proposal, I might be persuaded to overlook these title irregularities. As a wedding gift, so to speak." Clara felt rage building in her chest like a prairie fire. "I'd rather lose everything than spend a single day as your wife." Blackwood's expression darkened. "That can be arranged, my dear. In fact, it might happen sooner than you think. This is dangerous country, after all. Accidents happen. Fires start. Good men die in their beds." This time the threat was so open that even Blackwood's own men shifted uncomfortably in their saddles. Several of them exchanged glances, clearly uneasy with their boss's increasingly reckless behavior. Ethan's hand moved to his gun. "I think you've said enough, Blackwood. Time for you to leave." "Or what? You'll shoot me down in front of witnesses." "That wouldn't be very smart, Cross. I'm a respected businessman in this territory. You're just a drifter with delusions of grandeur." "Actually," Ethan said quietly, "I'm a U.S. Marshal with federal authority to investigate crimes across territorial boundaries. And what you just did constitutes criminal threatening under federal law." He reached into his coat and pulled out his badge, the silver star catching the afternoon sunlight. Several of Blackwood's men immediately began backing their horses away, clearly wanting no part of a confrontation with federal law enforcement. Blackwood stared at the badge in shock, his face cycling through a range of emotions from disbelief to fury to something that might have been fear. "You're bluffing," he said finally. "No marshal would resign his commission to play games in a backwater like this." "I didn't resign," Ethan replied calmly. "I took a leave of absence to investigate a pattern of suspicious deaths and illegal land acquisitions across 3 territories. Deaths that all seemed to benefit the same man." Now Blackwood's face had gone completely white. "You have no proof?" "Of anything. Not yet, but I'm working on it. And threatening a federal officer's wife in front of witnesses isn't going to help your case." For a moment, Clara thought Blackwood might actually draw his weapon despite the hopelessness of his position. His hand twitched toward his gun, and she could see the rage burning in his pale eyes. But whatever else he might be, Victor Blackwood wasn't stupid. Shooting a federal marshal would bring down the full weight of the territorial government on his head, no matter how much money and influence he possessed. "This isn't over," he said finally, his voice tight with suppressed fury. "No," Ethan agreed, "it's not. But next time you want to threaten my wife, you might want to consider the consequences more carefully." Blackwood wheeled his horse around and spurred it toward the gate, his men following in a cloud of dust and confusion. But as they rode away, Clara heard him call back one final threat. "Enjoy your honeymoon, Mrs. Cross. It may be shorter then. You expect." As the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance, Clara found herself trembling with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. In the space of 24 hours, her life had changed completely. She had gone from being an unmarried rancher's daughter to the wife of a federal marshal, from victim to protected witness in what was clearly a much larger investigation. Ethan holstered his weapon and turned to look at her, his gray eyes full of concern. "Are you all right?" Clara looked up at this man who was now her husband, this enigmatic stranger who had risked everything to save her from a fate worse than death. She thought about the gentle way he had kissed her in the church, the protective way he positioned himself between her and danger, the quiet strength in his voice when he had faced down Blackwood's threats. "I'm fine," she said, and realized she meant it. "We're going to be fine." Ethan smiled, and Clara felt her heart skip a beat. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever dangers they would face together, she was beginning to believe that her impulsive decision to trust this mysterious man might turn out to be the best choice she had ever made. The weeks that followed their confrontation with Blackwood passed in a strange mixture of domestic tranquility and underlying tension. Clara found herself settling into married life with surprising ease, though she and Ethan maintained separate bedrooms as promised. Their relationship had evolved into something comfortable yet charged with possibility, like the air before a summer storm. Each morning, Clara would wake to find Ethan already up and working around the ranch. He had thrown himself into the daily operations with the dedication of a man who understood that physical labor could be both productive and therapeutic. Samuel had gratefully accepted his help, and together they had begun making improvements that the ranch had needed for years. The poisoned water trough had been cleaned and refilled, the barn thoroughly aired out and restocked with fresh hay. Ethan had also taken it upon himself to repair the sagging fence posts and reinforce the barn doors with heavy iron bars that could be secured from the inside. Every change he made was practical and necessary, but Clara noticed that they also had the effect of making the ranch more defensible. She had taken to bringing him coffee in the mornings, usually finding him in the corral working with the horses. There was something almost hypnotic about watching him gentle a skittish mar or train a young colt. His movements were patient and sure, his voice low and soothing as he worked. Clara often found herself lingering longer than necessary, captivated by the quiet competence he brought to everything he touched. Their conversations during these morning interludes had gradually become more personal. Ethan had begun sharing stories of his travels as a marshal, carefully edited tales that gave her glimpses into the man he had been before grief and duty had brought him to Copper Ridge Valley. In return, Clara found herself opening up about her dreams for the ranch, her memories of her mother, and her fears about the future. It was during one of these conversations that she learned more about his investigation into Blackwood's activities. "I've been tracking him for 2 years," Ethan said as he worked a currycomb through his horse's coat. "Starting in Montana after Marcus died, then following a trail of suspicious deaths and land acquisitions through Wyoming and Colorado." Clara leaned against the fence rail, cradling her coffee cup in both hands. "How many people has he killed? Directly? I can prove. Maybe 3 or 4 cases, including my brother. But indirectly, through intimidation, forced sales, and engineered accidents? Dozens, entire families displaced, communities destroyed." His jaw tightened. "The worst part is how careful he's been to stay within the letter of the law, or at least to make it appear that way. Until now." Ethan paused in his grooming, his eyes meeting hers over the horse's back. "Until now." Threatening a federal officer's wife in front of witnesses was the first real mistake he's made. But I need more than that to build a case that will stick. What kind of evidence? Financial records, witness testimony, documentation of his business practices. The kind of proof that requires getting close to his operation. Ethan resumed his work, but Clara could see the tension in his shoulders. The kind of proof that puts people in danger. Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. You're planning something, aren't you? I'm considering options. Ethan. She waited until he looked at her again. Whatever you're thinking of doing, you don't have to do it alone. I can help. His expression softened, but he shook his head. Clara, I appreciate the offer, but this isn't your fight. It became my fight the moment Blackwood tried to buy me like a piece of livestock. And it definitely became my fight when I married the man he's been hunting. Clara set down her coffee cup and moved closer. You said yourself that you need to get close to his operation. Well, I know things about this valley, about the people who work for him. I might be able to help in ways you haven't considered. Ethan was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing her words against his protective instincts. Finally he sighed and put down the currycomb. There's a social event next week, he said reluctantly. Some kind of harvest celebration that Blackwood sponsors every year. All the local ranchers and their families are invited, along with various businessmen and territorial officials. I know about it. Papa and I have gone the last few years. It's Blackwood's way of showing off his wealth and influence. This year, it might also be his way of trying to rehabilitate his reputation after our very public confrontation. If we attend as husband and wife, it would send a message that we're not afraid of him. Clara considered this. And while we're there, you could observe his operation, maybe overhear conversations or see something useful. Potentially. But Clara, if we do this, we'll be walking into the lion's den. Blackwood will have home field advantage, and he'll be surrounded by his allies and employees. He'll also be surrounded by witnesses. Even Blackwood wouldn't dare try anything too obvious at his own party. Ethan smiled grimly. You'd be surprised what desperate men will dare, especially when their backs are against the wall. Despite his warnings, Clara could see that he was warming to the idea. The more they discussed it, the more feasible it seemed. They would attend the celebration as the respectable married couple they appeared to be, using the social occasion to gather information while demonstrating that they couldn't be intimidated. Samuel, when they presented the plan to him that evening, was predictably horrified. Absolutely not, he said firmly. Clara, that man has already threatened you directly. Walking into his house would be like putting your head in a noose. Papa, we can't hide here forever, Clara argued. Sooner or later, we have to show that we're not afraid of him. Besides, what could he possibly do at a public gathering with half the territory watching? More than you might think, Samuel replied darkly. Victor Blackwood has been the unofficial king of this valley for years. In his own house, surrounded by his people, there's no telling what he might try. But Ethan had been thinking about the tactical advantages as well as the risks. Samuel's right about the dangers, he said slowly. But there are potential benefits that might outweigh them. Blackwood's been operating in shadows for years, using intermediaries and cutouts to keep his hands clean. If I can get into his private study during the party, I might find records or correspondence that could break this case wide open. Clara felt her pulse quicken. You mean steal evidence? I mean gather intelligence in the course of a federal investigation. If I'm attending as a guest and I happen to notice incriminating materials lying around, he shrugged. Well, criminals shouldn't leave sensitive documents where officers of the law might stumble across them. Samuel still looked unconvinced. And if you get caught? If this whole thing goes wrong? Then at least we'll have tried, Clara said quietly. Papa, I can't live the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, wondering when Blackwood will make his next move. If there's a chance to end this, we have to take it. The debate continued for another hour. But gradually Samuel's resistance wore down in the face of their combined determination. Finally, he threw up his hands in defeat. "Fine," he said. "But I'm coming with you, and we go armed." "Agreed," Ethan said. "But we'll need to be subtle about it. This has to look like a social call, not a military operation." The next few days were spent in careful preparation. Clara selected her finest dress, a deep blue silk that had belonged to her mother, and Ethan acquired appropriate formal wear from the general store in town. They practiced their cover story until it was second nature. They were the happy newlyweds, grateful for Blackwood's gracious invitation and looking forward to being accepted into local society. Meanwhile, Ethan spent hours studying the layout of Blackwood's estate, which he had scouted during his rides around the valley. The main house was a sprawling adobe structure built around a central courtyard, with Blackwood's private study located on the second floor, overlooking the gardens. If Ethan could slip away during the festivities, he estimated he would have perhaps 15 minutes to search for useful documents before his absence would be noticed. The morning of the party dawned clear and warm, with the kind of golden autumn light that made the desert landscape look almost magical. Clara spent extra time on her appearance, pinning her hair up in an elaborate style and using a touch of rouge to bring color to her cheeks. When she came downstairs, both her father and husband stopped talking to stare. "You look stunning," Ethan said, and the admiration in his voice made Clara's cheeks warm. "Thank you. You clean up pretty well yourself." And he did. In his formal black suit with a white shirt and string tie, Ethan looked every inch the respectable gentleman. Only the slight bulge under his left arm hinted at the colt concealed beneath his jacket. They made the journey to Blackwood's estate in Samuel's best wagon, with Clara riding between the two men and trying to project an air of calm confidence she didn't feel. As they approached the imposing gates of the Blackwood property, she could see other guests arriving in carriages and on horseback. The territorial elite had turned out in force for what was clearly the social event of the season. The house itself was even more impressive than Clara had expected. Built in the Spanish colonial style with whitewashed walls and red tile roofs, it sprawled across several acres and was surrounded by elaborate gardens that must have cost a fortune to maintain in the desert climate. Servants in crisp uniforms directed the arriving guests toward a large courtyard, where tables laden with food and drink had been arranged under colorful awnings. Blackwood himself stood near the entrance, greeting his guests with the practiced charm of a politician. He was dressed in an expensive gray suit that emphasized his distinguished appearance, and he moved through the crowd with the easy confidence of a man completely in his element. When he spotted Clara, Ethan, and Samuel approaching, his smile never wavered, but Clara caught the flash of something darker in his pale eyes. "Mr. and Mrs. Cross," he said warmly, extending his hand to Ethan. "How delighted I am that you could join us this evening." Ethan shook the offered hand with apparent cordiality. "Thank you for the invitation, Mr. Blackwood. Your home is quite impressive." "You're too kind. And Mrs. Cross, you look absolutely radiant. Marriage clearly agrees with you." Clara forced herself to smile graciously. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood. It's very generous of you to include us in your celebration." "Nonsense. My dear, you're part of our community now. I do hope we can put our previous misunderstandings behind us and move forward as neighbors should." The words were perfectly reasonable, even gracious, but Clara caught the subtle emphasis on certain phrases that turned them into barely veiled threats. Blackwood was reminding them that this was his territory, his celebration, and they were here at his sufferance. "Of course," she replied smoothly. "Fresh starts are always welcome." "Indeed they are. Now please, help yourselves to refreshments. I believe you'll find the wine particularly good. It's imported directly from California." As they moved away from their host and into the main body of the party, Clara felt some of her tension ease. Whatever Blackwood's ulterior motives, he was clearly committed to maintaining the facade of gracious hospitality, at least while other guests were watching. The party was indeed impressive. A mariachi band played lively music from a small stage, while servants circulated with trays of food and drink. The guest list read like a who's who of Arizona Territory society, including several territorial officials, prominent ranchers, and successful businessmen. Clara recognized many faces from her occasional trips to larger towns, though she had never moved in such elevated social circles. "Quite a production," Ethan murmured as they accepted glasses of wine from a passing servant. "Blackwood always did like to make an impression," Samuel replied. "The question is what he's really celebrating." They mingled with the other guests, playing their roles as the happy newlyweds while keeping their eyes and ears open for useful information. Clara found herself the center of considerable attention, as news of her dramatic auction and subsequent marriage had spread throughout the territory. Most of the curiosity seemed benign, though she noticed that several of Blackwood's closer associates watched her with expressions that were harder to read. About an hour into the festivities, Ethan caught Clara's eye and nodded slightly toward the house. It was time for him to attempt his reconnaissance mission. Clara felt her heart rate increase, but she kept her expression neutral as he excused himself to use the facilities. To provide cover for his absence, Clara engaged a group of ranchers' wives in animated conversation about the latest fashions from back east. It was exactly the kind of frivolous female chatter that men typically ignored, making it perfect camouflage for Ethan's activities. Meanwhile, Samuel positioned himself near the bar where he could observe the crowd and watch for any signs that Ethan's mission had been discovered. The plan was for Ethan to return within 15 minutes, and if he didn't appear by then, Samuel would create a distraction while Clara found an excuse to look for him. But as the minutes ticked by with no sign of her husband, Clara began to feel increasingly anxious. The conversation about silk versus cotton fabrics became harder to maintain as her mind raced through all the things that could have gone wrong. Had Ethan been caught in Blackwood's study? Had he encountered unexpected security? Or worse, had this whole invitation been a trap designed to separate them and leave him vulnerable? Just as she was beginning to seriously consider abandoning her cover, she spotted Ethan emerging from the house and moving casually back toward the courtyard. He looked completely relaxed, as if he had indeed just stepped away to freshen up. But Clara noticed the slight tension around his eyes that suggested he had found something significant. He rejoined their conversation with easy charm, complimenting the ladies on their dresses and asking about their families. But when he looked at Clara, she saw excitement carefully controlled behind his calm exterior. "Darling," he said after a few minutes, "I think I may have had a bit too much wine. Perhaps we should take a short walk in the gardens to clear my head." Clara immediately recognized this as a signal that he needed to share what he had discovered. "Of course," she said, taking his offered arm. "The evening air will do us both good." They excused themselves from the group and strolled toward the elaborate gardens that surrounded the house. Samuel, who had been watching from across the courtyard, caught their signal and began to drift in their direction. Once they were relatively isolated among the flowering shrubs and decorative fountains, Ethan's careful composure cracked slightly. "I found it," he said quietly. "Clara, I found exactly what I needed." "What?" she asked breathlessly. "Financial records, correspondence with corrupt officials, even a ledger detailing payments to hired killers. Blackwood's been keeping meticulous records of his criminal activities for years." Samuel joined them at that moment, and Ethan quickly filled him in on his discoveries. "The man's either incredibly arrogant or incredibly stupid," Ethan concluded. "He's documented everything, probably as insurance against his associates trying to betray him." "Did you take anything?" Samuel asked. "I couldn't risk it. Too many servants moving around, and someone might have noticed missing documents." but I memorized enough details to know exactly what to look for when I come back with a proper search warrant. Clara felt a thrill of excitement mixed with apprehension. When will that be? I'll need to get word to my superior in Santa Fe. Probably through the territorial marshal's office. Could take a week or two to arrange, but once we have official authorization. Ethan's smile was grim with satisfaction. Victor Blackwood's reign of terror is about to come to an end. They were so focused on their conversation that none of them noticed the figure watching from the shadows near the house until it was too late. Jake Morrison stepped out from behind a large oleander bush, his hand resting casually on his gun. Well, he drawled. Having a nice private chat, are we? Clara's blood turned to ice water. How much had he overheard? And more importantly, what did he plan to do about it? Just getting some air, Ethan replied calmly, but Clara could see him calculating distances and angles. Morrison was too far away to rush, but close enough that drawing a weapon would be suicide. Funny thing, Morrison continued. Mr. Blackwood sent me to check on you folks when he noticed you'd wandered off. Said he wanted to make sure you were having a good time at his party. We're having a wonderful time, Clara said, forcing brightness into her voice. Your employer certainly knows how to entertain. Morrison's cold smile suggested he wasn't buying their innocent act. Yeah, he's real good at entertaining. Real good at making sure his guests feel welcome. Speaking of which, he asked me to invite you back to the party. Seems there's going to be a special announcement. Clara exchanged a glance with Ethan. They didn't have much choice but to comply, but she had a sinking feeling that Blackwood's special announcement was going to be anything but good news. As they walked back toward the courtyard with Morrison behind them, Clara noticed that the atmosphere of the party had subtly changed. The music still played and the guests still mingled, but there was an undercurrent of tension that hadn't been there before. Several of Blackwood's men had positioned themselves around the perimeter of the gathering, and Clara realized with growing alarm that what had seemed like a social celebration was beginning to feel more like a trap. Blackwood was waiting for them near the small stage where the mariachi band had been playing. The musicians had stepped aside, and their host now stood alone in the spotlight, his pale eyes scanning the crowd with predatory satisfaction. Ladies and gentlemen, he called out, his voice carrying easily across the courtyard. If I could have your attention for just a moment, I have a special announcement to make. The conversations gradually died away as the guests turned toward their host. Clara found herself positioned near the front of the crowd, with Ethan beside her and Samuel slightly behind. She noticed that Morrison and several other armed men had quietly moved to block the exits. As you all know, Blackwood continued, Copper Ridge Valley has been my home for many years. I've worked hard to build a community here, to bring prosperity and civilization to this wild frontier. But recently, I've discovered that our peaceful valley has been infiltrated by outside agitators who seek to destroy everything we've built. Clara felt her heart beginning to race. Where was this leading? It pains me to report that we have a federal spy in our midst, Blackwood said, his voice heavy with false regret. A man who has been masquerading as a simple drifter while actually gathering intelligence for a government that seeks to interfere with our local affairs. Several guests gasped and began looking around suspiciously. Clara noticed that all eyes seemed to be focusing on Ethan, and she realized with horror that their cover had been completely blown. Mr. Ethan Cross, Blackwood continued, pointing directly at Clara's husband, is in fact a deputy U.S. Marshal who has been conducting an unauthorized investigation into the legitimate business activities of myself and other prominent citizens. Now the crowd was buzzing with shocked conversations. Some guests seemed outraged by the revelation, while others appeared confused or frightened. Clara could see territorial officials exchanging worried glances, clearly uncertain about how to respond to such a dramatic accusation. Furthermore, Blackwood said, raising his voice to quiet the murmurs. "I have evidence that Marshal Cross has been using his marriage to Miss Clara Whitmore as cover for his illegal surveillance activities." Clara felt her cheeks burn with humiliation and rage. Not only was Blackwood exposing Ethan's identity, he was also implying that their marriage was nothing more than a sham designed to facilitate his investigation. Ethan stepped forward, his hand moving openly to his badge. "Since you've already revealed my identity, Mr. Blackwood, let me be perfectly clear about something. I am indeed a deputy U.S. Marshal, and I am conducting a completely legal investigation into a pattern of criminal activities that crosses territorial boundaries." A murmur ran through the crowd at this confirmation. Several people began backing away, clearly wanting no part of whatever confrontation was about to unfold. "Legal?" Blackwood laughed harshly. "You're operating without proper jurisdiction, Marshal. This is territorial business, not federal. You have no authority here." "I have authority to investigate federal crimes wherever they occur," Ethan replied steadily. "And conspiracy to commit murder across state and territorial lines is definitely a federal crime." Now Blackwood's mask of civility began to slip. "You have no proof of any such thing, don't I?" Ethan's smile was cold as winter ice. "I've spent the last 2 years documenting your activities, Blackwood. Deaths in Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, and here in Arizona. All following the same pattern, all benefiting the same man." "Lies and speculation," Blackwood snapped. "You can't prove anything. Actually, I can. Especially now that I've seen your private records." The admission hung in the air like a gunshot. Clara saw Blackwood's face go white with rage as he realized that Ethan had indeed found something incriminating in his study. "You broke into my home," Blackwood said, his voice deadly quiet. "I was an invited guest who happened to notice some interesting documents lying around. Documents that detail payments to hired killers, bribes to corrupt officials, and a systematic campaign of intimidation and murder spanning 4 territories." Several people in the crowd gasped at these accusations. Clara noticed that some of Blackwood's own associates were beginning to look nervous, clearly having second thoughts about their involvement with a man who might be facing federal prosecution. Blackwood seemed to realize that his carefully constructed facade was crumbling beyond repair. His hand moved toward his gun, and Clara saw several of his men tense in response. "I think it's time for you to leave, Marshal," Blackwood said coldly. "You and your wife and her father, right now." "I don't think so," Ethan replied calmly. "In fact, I think it's time for you to surrender yourself for arrest." "On what charges?" "How about threatening a federal officer, conspiracy to commit murder, extortion, and about a dozen other federal crimes?" Ethan's voice carried the authority of his badge. "Victor Blackwood, you're under arrest." For a moment, Clara thought Blackwood might actually surrender. He stood frozen, his face cycling through a range of emotions as he weighed his options. But then his expression hardened into something ugly and desperate. "The hell I am," he snarled, and his hand went for his gun. What happened next was chaos. Ethan drew his weapon with lightning speed, but Blackwood's men were already moving. Gunshots rang out across the courtyard as the guests screamed and scattered for cover. Clara found herself being pushed toward the ground by her father as bullets whined overhead. Through the confusion, she could see Ethan taking cover behind an overturned table, returning fire at Blackwood's men. The rancher himself had disappeared into the crowd, probably heading for his house and whatever escape route he had prepared for such an emergency. "We have to get out of here," Samuel shouted over the gunfire. But as Clara looked toward the exits, she realized they were still blocked by armed men. They were trapped in the middle of a gunfight with no way to escape. Whatever happened next, she had a feeling that their carefully planned infiltration mission was about to become a fight for their very lives. The gunfight lasted only minutes, but it felt like hours to Clara as she crouched behind an overturned table with her father, listening to bullets splinter the wood above their heads. Through the chaos and screaming, she could hear Ethan's voice, calling out commands to the territorial officials who had begun returning fire alongside him. "Sheriff Harrison, take your men around the left flank. Don't let anyone reach the stables." Clara realized with growing hope that not everyone at the party had been loyal to Blackwood. Several territorial lawmen and honest ranchers had rallied to Ethan's side once his true identity was revealed, evening the odds considerably. The tide turned when reinforcements arrived. Clara heard the thunder of hoofbeats and looked up to see a dozen federal marshals charging into the courtyard, their badges gleaming in the lantern light. Ethan's distress signal had reached the right ears, and help had arrived with perfect timing. "Federal marshals, drop your weapons." The commanding voice cut through the gunfire like a blade. Blackwood's men, already demoralized by their bosses' flight, began throwing down their guns and raising their hands. The fight went out of them quickly once they realized they were facing federal law enforcement, rather than just one lone marshal. As the dust settled and order was restored, Clara found herself helping tend to the wounded while Ethan coordinated with his fellow marshals. Blackwood himself had vanished during the confusion, but his escape would be short-lived. Every lawman in the territory now knew his face and his crimes. 2 days later, Clara stood on the porch of her family's ranch, watching the sunrise paint the valley in shades of gold and crimson. The events at Blackwood's party felt like something from a dream, but the bandage on her arm where a bullet had grazed her served as a tangible reminder of how real the danger had been. Ethan emerged from the barn, no longer the mysterious drifter who had arrived seeking work. His federal badge was prominently displayed now, and there was a new confidence in his bearing that came from no longer having to hide who he truly was. "They found him," he said without preamble as he approached the porch. Clara felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. "Where?" "Trying to cross into Mexico. The marshals caught up with him at a border town. He's in federal custody now along with most of his organization." Ethan's smile was grim with satisfaction. "It's over, Clara, really over." She sank into the porch swing, suddenly feeling the weight of exhaustion she'd been holding at bay. "What happens now?" Ethan sat beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence. "Now there's a trial, probably in Santa Fe. I'll have to testify, and you and your father might be called as witnesses. But after that—" He paused, his gray eyes searching her face. "After that, we'll decide what comes next." Clara understood the unspoken question behind Ethan's words. Their marriage had started out as a last resort to protect her from Blackwood's threats. Now that danger had passed, they were free to choose their own future. "The annulment," she said softly, "if that's what you want." Ethan's voice was calm, but Clara noticed the tension in his shoulders. "I meant it when I said I don't expect anything from you. This choice is yours to make." She studied his profile, committing to memory the strong curve of his jaw and the way the morning sun lit the silver in his eyes. Over the past weeks, she had come to know the man beneath the badge, the one who risked everything for justice, who showed kindness, courage, and a heart bigger than she could have imagined. She felt things she'd never known before, the flutter in her chest when he smiled, the comfort of his steady presence in dark moments, and the spark that flared whenever they were close. "What do you want, Ethan?" she asked quietly. He turned to her, and in his storm-gray eyes, she saw her own emotions mirrored back. "I want whatever brings you happiness, Clara. If that means ending this marriage so you can be free, that's what I want for you. That's not what I asked." Ethan was silent for a while, his hands clenched together. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with feeling. "I want to wake up every day knowing you're here beside me. I want to help you rebuild this ranch and make it better than it ever was. I want to truly earn the right to call you my wife, not just in name." He met her gaze, nothing hidden. "I want to spend my life loving you, if you'll let me." Tears filled Clara's eyes, but they were tears of happiness. She took his hands, marveling at how naturally theirs fit together. "Then I guess it's time to make this marriage real," she whispered. Ethan's smile lit up his face like the dawn breaking over the mountains. When he kissed her this time, it was full of promise, passion, and hope for their future. When they parted, Clara leaned her forehead against his, breathing in the familiar scent of sage and leather that she cherished. "I love you too," she said softly. "I think my heart started to fall for you the night you stood between me and Blackwood's men." 6 months later, Clara stood in the doorway of their newly restored ranch house, watching Ethan work gently with a young colt in the corral. Together, they had turned the Whitmore ranch into one of the most successful spreads in Copper Ridge Valley. After Blackwood's trial and conviction, Ethan left the marshals to focus on ranching and occasionally advising law enforcement, a choice that surprised many, but not Clara. After years chasing justice through dark places, Ethan wanted to build something good in the light. Samuel had taken up the post of sheriff in Redstone Creek, a role that fit him well and gave the couple the privacy they needed to truly start their life together. As she watched Ethan calm the spirited horse with steady hands and a soothing voice, Clara placed a hand over the slight curve of her belly. Their first child was on the way. She hadn't told him yet, waiting for just the right moment. A warm breeze carried the scent of spring blooms across the valley, and Clara smiled, remembering her father's words. The best things in life often come disguised as the most frightening. What had begun in fear and desperation had grown into a love deeper than she'd ever dared to hope for. The man who had risked everything to save her had given her not just safety, but a true partnership, a love built on respect and affection, and a future filled with promise. Sometimes, the greatest treasures came from the most unexpected places, and sometimes, the biggest risks turned out to be the most rewarding. As Clara stepped out into the golden light to join Ethan, she knew every risk they'd taken had been worth it. In Copper Ridge Valley, where the dust never settled and hope always bloomed, their hearts had finally found home. And as Ethan wrapped his arms around her, Clara knew this was the kind of story worth living. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.